I'll be recording this, as everybody knows. And one of the reasons why I started the Career Conversations Book Club, just for everybody's reminder information, is because three things that I really love includes books. I've always been a book lover, career conversations and powerful career conversations, and bringing people together in community. And so when I was looking at all the different books that I had from different authors that I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to share these conversations? The idea came up, and I'm really delighted to have all of you join Gorick and I for this evening. If you like, feel free to post your thoughts on social media with the hashtag GA Career Conversations. And we're going to hear from Gorick in a couple of minutes, but a few quick notes before we begin, especially as I see that there are some of you who are joining the 2024 book club that hadn't joined us last year. The format for tonight, which is the format that we've been following for most of the book clubs, is really pretty simple. We're going to have some introductory comments to hear about Gorick and his career journey, because it's always important to hear about people's journeys from other perspectives. Then we're going to have Q&A that I have discussed with Gorick ahead of time, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. So it's about an equal third, a third, and a third split as we dive into the book. I will ask that you all keep your microphones muted, please, at least during the initial part of the session. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and I'm constantly monitoring, so we'll go back and forth and look at the chat, and we'll be answering as we can and as we are able to. The session is being recorded, as I mentioned, so that it can be shared afterwards. And for Ontario lawyers, just to let you know, we are awaiting registration with the Law Society. I will get information out in terms of professionalism approval once I have that information. And lastly, before we move forward, we've talked about having brave spaces and having safe spaces. And last year sometime, I saw the work of Elise Ahankora, who I really want to acknowledge and welcome to our conversation through an article that she wrote. The link is something that I had sent out to everybody before, and she talked about brave spaces being exhausting. And since that time, I've used her language about accountable space instead, in which we're all responsible for ourselves, our intentions, our words, and our actions. And so I'm hoping that everybody here starts with good intentions. Understand that aligning your intent with action is the true test of commitment. And so to that end, I really am looking forward to having this as an accountable space for all of us. So with all that behind and a great conversation to look forward to, I'm going to stop sharing for now because I wanted to see everybody. Hello and good evening, everybody. And Gorick, welcome. I'm so excited to have you join us. Before we start learning about your career journey and diving into this wonderful book about the unspoken rules, I know you want to ask some preliminary questions of those who are online. And I see some really some names of people that I just want to say, hello, everyone. But Gorick, let's turn it over to you for the survey first.
That sounds great. Well, Gina, thanks so much for bringing us all together tonight. And thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be spending this time with me. I know I'm going to be doing a lot of talking today, and I'm flattered that you're taking the time to listen to me. But for those of you who have dove into my work a little bit, you'll notice that my book didn't just come out of the shower. It didn't just come from thoughts that came to me from some divine intervention. It actually came from real people and real conversations. And so I want to start off tonight's conversation with some surveys with all of you, with the intention of trying to get into your minds and hearts a little bit on what's going on in your life right now and where are you coming from. So I put this QR code right up on the screen. What I'm going to do is advance to the next slide. And I'm going to go back for a second, just so you all have another second to take a look at that QR code. I've also copied and pasted the link into the chat window. All responses are anonymous, but I've got some at the beginning of tonight's conversation and then some at the end. And this is just a chance for me to get to know you a little bit better. It'll make for a more interesting conversation, and hopefully I'll be able to reference some of your pains and goals throughout my answers tonight as well. So once again, pollev.com/GORICK. Just because we're always short on time and there's a lot to cover tonight, I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next slide. For those of you who are just seeing your screen share here, There's a QR code at the top right-hand corner. Feel free to scan that QR code and you'll still access the poll. So my first question here was, where are you currently in your career? Okay. So no one is in school anymore. Everyone's doing this whole adulting thing now, whether you're in your first job out of school, third job out of school, fourth job out of school, or fifth job and beyond. Very cool. Great to see so much experience here in the room. I've got another question for you all, which is the following. I've got one after this, so please stay on that screen. What field are you in? And you could define this in whatever way you'd like. A couple of options that I just threw out there. You're in law, you're in government, you're in education, you're in healthcare, you're in engineering, you're in research. So I'm seeing here law, finance, law, coaching, law, business. Wonder who that is.
Not me. I know who else.
Okay, great. It's great to see so much diversity here. Ontario government lawyer, nonprofit finance, engineering, law and coaching. Fantastic. Great. And I have one last question before we get into tonight's conversation. And it is the following. What are you struggling with most right now when it comes to your career? Go ahead, answer in a few words, in a sentence, in several sentences. And once again, everything is anonymous. And for those of you who don't yet have that screen up on your phones or on your computers, there's the QR code at the top right-hand corner. And then there's also pollev.com/Gorick if you'd like to type it into your browser or check out the link in the chat window.
Love the answers that are coming up.
Yes, and Gina, I'm curious, are you surprised? Are you not surprised?
Unfortunately, not surprised. When I see imposter syndrome, not surprised. I'm not surprised, I think, with so many of the conversations that we've had, but it's good for people to be sharing. And that one that I just saw right now, boundaries and overwork, is one that I've seen time and time again. And time is a challenge related to boundaries and overwork. So not surprised, Gorick. How about you? Are these things that are surprising you as you read some of these answers?
You know, yeah, fortunately or unfortunately not. And now let's live a glass half full life here. I'd say it's not disappointing to see this because, well, it just shows that we're not alone. And I remember, I'll probably talk a little bit more about this when we get into the origin story of my book, but it didn't start off as a book project. It started off with a great deal of loneliness on my part because I was there working in my first job out of school and wondering to myself, am I the only one who has this imposter syndrome, who is struggling to draw boundaries, who is feeling unconfident because I've gotten this bad performance evaluation and my last job didn't quite go so well. So if you take just one thing away from these polls tonight, take away this, which is that you're not alone. We're going to have more polls towards the end of tonight's conversation, but I just wanted to thank you all for being so vulnerable and for setting the stage so well for all of us. Thank you.
That is great. Thank you, Gorick, for asking these questions and for everybody for participating. It really is a good starting point for us to have the conversation. So as Gorick mentioned, we want to hear about his career journey, because what I think is really useful is to learn about others' paths, not to feel alone, to be inspired, a combination of those two. So if you could share with us, especially showing what's possible for a first generation, for anybody who's not familiar with that term, somebody who is the first to go to university in their family. But let us hear a little bit about your career story, some of the personal highlights of your career, and how did you start each role, and why did you transition from one role to the other? Over to you for this.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, so I'll start the origin story from where I know a number of you are in right now, which is Ontario. So I was born and raised in Toronto. I'm the proud son of a working class single mom who left school when she was 12 years old. I went to Mark Garneau Collegiate right near the Science Center, went to the TOPS program for math and science. And it was one of the best things that could have happened to me because it was there that I learned that chemistry, math, physics, biology, they were not my strengths. And so when university came around, I ended up studying first economics, couldn't stay awake in second year economics, so switched over to political science. And along the way, actually did a lot of extracurricular activities. So in university, I ran a dry cleaning business of all things. That was my way to pay my way through school. It was also my way of building my resume a little bit. After university, I worked at Boston Consulting Group, had also spent some time in New York on Wall Street working at Credit Suisse in investment banking, returned to get my MBA at Harvard Business School, and then met a professor who encouraged me to write a book 5 years later. And it came out in the form of what you see here, which is the Unspoken Rules, Secrets to Starting Your Career Off Right. Now, I've changed my mind a lot of times throughout those pivots. I mean, if you were to backtrack through what I had wanted to do throughout my upbringing, I mean, my very first career aspiration was to be a bus driver, and then a magician, and then a doctor, and then a journalist, and then someone, and then I think a nurse, and then a doctor, and then a lawyer, and then an entrepreneur, and then an investment banker. So I've name your career path, and I've probably pondered over it. I went through a third of an LSAT textbook, and then realized that those logic games were just not my forte. So changed my mind a lot. And all throughout that experience, I had the great privilege of going to Harvard. And it was at that point in time that I realized just how much my friends who came from backgrounds where they had older siblings or parents who had been there and done that would be able to teach them over the dinner table. Where I remember walking home from the library one night, I was studying at the library, and I was on my way to go to bed when all of a sudden a number of my classmates walked in the opposite direction. And it turned out that they were off to an invite only recruiting event put on by one of the employers that had come onto campus and had cherry picked who they wanted to meet. And that was their first round interview. Now, I didn't even know that that opportunity was even available. And it was because when I went to that career fair, I was so focused on the free swag that was on the table that I wasn't building the relationships, that I wasn't selling myself. And it turns out that before I even thought that the job search had begun, I was already behind. And it took mentorship and a whole bunch of things that I can talk to you more about. But when I got into the real world and I got into my first corporate job, those what I call now unspoken rules came to the forefront again, where I remember sitting at my desk, setting up my laptop, setting up my email, sitting beside a coworker who had started the same job at the same time at the same level. And she had already had a calendar full of lunches, coffee chats, and fast forward, and she was disappearing off to cool business trips and meetings and conferences. And I was still waiting for my first assignment. And it was then that I realized, wow, there is so much that school does not teach you about how to do this adulting thing. And it's this informal education that creates a big rift between those who have those mentors whispering in their ears and those who don't. And so what started off as just frustrating notes that I had written for myself in my own journal became conversations, became interviews, became a book proposal, became a book, and is now turning into an online course and other products that I can talk to you more about and services. But it all came from me thinking in the same way that you all just did about how lonely it felt to start my career off right. I won't talk your ear off. Let me pause there. But that's the long story long.
No, I love it. And I think one of the questions that follows up from that for me, for all of my authors, is one about how much of this, and I like the fact that you honestly said you had, what was it so far? I think I heard 12 different career aspirations. But what led you to the decisions that you made? Were they very strategic thinking? Because you may not have liked the logic games, but you seem to be a very organized career thinker. You're an advisor. And how much of that was serendipity? One of my favorite words, people will hear me say it often. How much of your career happened by chance and how much of it was it planned out?
So it was definitely a matter of seeing it to believe it. And then once I had a chance to experience it, reflecting on whether it was an energy vampire to me that it drained my energy, or whether it was an energy giver that this is actually something I enjoy and I could see myself doing long term. So when I think about, for example, in high school, I had thought about how I had been sick a lot growing up. And I wanted to make an impact in the world, as I'm sure all of you want to do. And I want to make a positive difference in the lives of other people. And the thing that I knew how to do, or that I knew existed as even a job, was to be a nurse or a doctor. So that was my aspiration then. Um, when it came to university, um, I had reflected upon my time in high school. I was actually one of the student trustees on the Toronto District School Board. So I sat on the school board as a student representative. And it was there that I had just the most amazing education, because I for the first time had this different definition of impact, where, as you know, a 16-year-old, I thought to myself, well, if I want to make a difference in the world, of course you'd be a doctor. You'd be saving lives, of course, duh. And then it was at the school board that I realized, oh, wow, there's so many ways of making an impact, and we're all playing a tiny role in this broader relay race. And one way to make a difference in other people's lives is through policy and education. And that got me interested in political science. Um, at Harvard, there is a vortex around two industries, finance and consulting. And so you can't walk down the dining hall without overhearing some conversation about getting a job on Wall Street or getting a job in management consulting. So my ears started getting sensitive, and I just didn't know what those terms we even were. So my ears started getting sensitive. I went to my dorm room, I started Googling, and Google ended up becoming this endless, I it was just like one tab open after another, until that became my aspiration. And I was fortunate enough to have gotten a chance to try out each of those roles. But it was also, moreover, a chance for me to understand that actually what I thought was a big weakness for me, not knowing these unspoken rules, could actually be maybe a superpower. This was what I was meant to do with my life, to channel what I thought of as a weakness, as a shortcoming, um, as something I was embarrassed about as the first in my family to go to university, um, into my own leg of the relay race, which is to write this book. So it was a lot of self-reflection, and I'm sure as I look around the room and see your smiling faces, I'm seeing that perhaps you're all doing that same exercise yourselves.
The self-reflection is so important, and it's something that we sometimes don't initiate on our own. Somebody has to remind us or let us know that it's okay to take the time to self-reflect, and it's okay to be unsure, and it's okay to think through things in that way. And I think few of us early on will do that self-reflection intentionally. So I'm so glad that you raised that, Gorick. I really appreciate it. Let's dive into the book. As usual, anybody who's been on a book club knows I had my pink tabs. It's been tabbed all over, but we're going to focus. We're going to try and focus on a few areas. But before we do, I want to start with the question that I ask all of the authors, and that's why. Yes, you were a first gen. Yes, somebody told you write a book, but what was your why for this? Why was this book so very important for you to research, to write, and then to share with the world at large?
Well, I'd say it comes from the head and the heart, where when it came to the heart, I shared with you my own experience as a first generation low income college student. There was also this deep desire on my side of wanting to make an impact, and and wanting. I had had all of these different terms that were swirling around in my head, around economic inequality, around empowering the next generation, around youth mentorship, around um, skills training and retraining. If you look at the news at all, you see that these are some of the biggest topics, on top of climate change and world peace. Like, there's just these were the topics that were permeating a lot of my mental energy, or just my shower thoughts. And I actually ended up really doing some deep reflection around why. What is one of the root causes as to why s- ambitious, hardworking, smart people fail to reach their full potential? And one of the big issues is bias and discrimination. Another one of those is a lack of awareness and an ability to navigate some of these unspoken rules. Where, when I looked out into the world and in the workplaces that I had been in, it's not always the case that it's the best ideas that come to come to life. It's not always the hardest working, most capable person who gets promoted. Oftentimes, it's the person who knows how to navigate some of these spaces. They know what to say, how to say it, when to say it. And these are some of those unspoken rules that no one really ever teaches you unless you're taught it informally. And so I thought, well, maybe I could play a small role in this simply by just writing down some of those unspoken rules and attaching some language to what has otherwise just remained tacit knowledge, as in it's like looking left and right before crossing the street, or it's like breathing. You just do it intuitively, or those who know how to do it intuitively. And then you just assume that someone else who doesn't know it is incapable, just doesn't get it. How many times have you heard that at work towards a coworker? Oh, they just don't get it. Well, it's an unknown unknown, as in it may not be that they don't want to do well. It's that they weren't aware that there's a certain set uh, of these unspoken rules that permeate some of the spaces that we operate. So that was the motivation on that front. And then there was the motivation on the head side, which was that I thought, wow, some of the biggest companies in the world that I had worked at pride themselves on training their employees, and they do a decent job, but so much of that training comes informally. What does that say about companies that are startups, nonprofits, the public sector that don't have these large departments to lead the training processes? What are they going to do? And so I thought, well, what if I could bottle up some of this tacit knowledge that someone otherwise has to learn over the first decade of their lives and democratize it to the world? What could that look like for enhancing our productivity as a society and helping people reach their full potential? So that's the why behind this book.
I'm really glad that you listen to your heart and to your head. And one of the things that you and I have had this conversation leading up to tonight, while your book is focused on helping new entrants into careers, into their professions, it has a lot of impact as well for anybody at any stage of their career, either personally for them or as they're thinking about themselves leading new people into their profession. So, while your focus may have been on newcomers into careers, it has far more, wider reach, I think, than just that. Have you gotten that feedback since you've released the book? I'm just curious if you've seen that.
Yes, I have. And in fact, I was chatting with a friend about how I'd say, whereas before I thought that my audience would primarily be of new grads and interns. This was, by the way, one of the unspoken rules of becoming an author. I didn't realize this at the time, but the job of an author isn't just writing, it's actually speaking. So a lot of my time these days is spent speaking at universities, speaking at actually a lot of law schools, um, and then speaking at companies. And when I think about the audiences of my keynotes and my fireside chats, many of them, I would say probably half of them, are mid-career professionals. So absolutely.
There's lots of good content for everybody. So let's get started. A framework. You talk about a framework, and I think you put a good explanation around what you were doing by giving us a framework for your. I counted 20 rules. I don't think I miscounted. There were 20 rules, and you named it a framework of the 3 C's: competence, commitment, and compatibility. Over to you to give us your definition of those 3 words. And let me just ask that first question, the definition, because the second part in your book, you have this really great way of identifying whether people are reaching those areas, whether they're overshooting or undershooting. And those choices as well of overshooting and undershooting was really meaningful as well. But let's start out. What do you mean by competence, commitment, and compatibility?
Sure thing. Well, the minute you show up, whether it's in a resume, a cover letter, a coffee chat, a client meeting, a one-on-one meeting with your manager, it's the minute you show up. And it's the minute that others start sizing you up and start asking themselves 3 questions. Question one is, can you do this job well? Which is the question of, are you competent? The second question is, are you excited to be here and to grow here? And that's the question of, are you committed? And then finally, it's, do we get along? And that's the question of, are we compatible? So are you competent? Are you committed? And are you compatible? The three C's. Your job, frankly, all of our jobs, and for the Canadians here, this includes the Prime Minister of Canada, it's to convince voters, shareholders, clients, your interviewer, your manager, your spouse, supposedly. I've heard that this applies to broader domains than just professional life. It's to convince others that you are, in fact, all of those three C's all the time. Convince others that you're competent and they'll want to invest in you and your career. Show that you are committed and folks will see you as maybe a future leader, as someone who is invested enough that maybe they should be investing in you. And then finally, show that you're compatible and people want to sit beside you and work with you and see you grow. And so when I think about these three C's, what's important to think about are two things. One, Gina, to your point, this is not a binary. So it's not that you are competent or you are not competent. What's important is when you try to figure out how you're doing, and no one ever really tells you at work how you're doing professionally and whether you're on the right track, look left, look right, and ask yourself, where do I sit when it comes to these three C's? Am I overshooting and maybe coming across as a know-it-all? Or am I maybe undershooting and coming across as if I'm apathetic? And the key to demonstrating these three C's is to strike that balance, to show the right dose of competence, commitment, and compatibility without overshooting, right, to that know-it-all territory, and not undershoot to the point where folks are wondering, why are you not speaking up? Is it that you're not competent, as in you don't understand the material? Or is it that you're not committed, that you don't care to speak up? Or is it that we're not compatible and that you don't really care about this meeting enough for you to be contributing? And then the second thing to be thinking about when it comes to these three C's is that no one's ever going to tell you where you sit. So it's going to be up to you to discern what is the culture of this place. What are the ways in which people express their competence, their commitment, and their compatibility? Is it that folks will give their status updates a certain way? Is it that people speak up in meetings a certain way? Is it that people socialize after work or before or after meetings a certain way? Use these three C's to figure out how you're doing.
And one of the things that I really liked is how applicable these rules and this framework is to any industry, whether it's law, whether it's engineering, whether it's teaching, whether it's the academic world. There's so much that is applicable regardless of what the substance of the work that you're doing is. And I think that's part of the appeal of this book in particular, and about the learnings from this book. We talked, you mentioned, and I think you used the language or the statement at page 17 early on, you talked about your uniqueness is not a liability, it's an asset. And in fact, it's a superpower waiting to be unleashed. I love that language that you used, and you spoke it earlier. Tell us, though, a little bit more about your thoughts about compatibility in particular, but bias and authenticity. That's where that give and take, back and forth might come in. And you talked about bias earlier, but when we talk about compatibility, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how to navigate that.
And I know in today's conversation in our room today, we have a number of coaches and folks in professional development. So you'll know this topic probably better than I do, where in the past, we as an organizations used to talk about culture fit a lot,
Mhm.
as in, does this person fit in with this team? And more recently, folks have started updating that language and started saying, well, it's actually not about culture fit, it's about culture add. As in, you will bring something new to the table that will make our team even better. And when I think about this idea of your uniqueness being a superpower, this was something that I don't know that I was in a position to accept, because I had that imposter syndrome and I was always focusing on what I was not versus what I was, and what I lacked instead of what I had. As in, I would look left, look right, and see others who were able to talk about their fancy summer vacations and beach homes and even just the sports and instruments that they played growing up. And I didn't have access to that financially. And I felt alone, frankly. And that permeated into how I conducted myself, because when I was sitting in meetings, there would be this just voice in my head that would be nagging at me and pulling me back from every comment that I wanted to make, and saying, and it was telling me, are you sure about this? Or this was probably a dumb idea, and someone's probably already thought about this, and this is really obvious. And so as the meeting was unfolding, I would be fighting this battle in my head without anyone ever even knowing about it. Um, until I realized that actually I had decent ideas, I'd like to think. Um, and actually people really wanted to hear from me. And in fact, a lot of my ideas were different because I came from a different background, or I had even just a different circle of friends, or I had a different um, uh, knowledge of the world, or I read different news sources. And what I realized was, and I started bringing this into meetings, and I encourage all of you to do the same, where um, as easy as it may be to just simply say, I agree. Your job, especially those of you who are lawyers, and I know there are a lot of you here in the room, it's to give advice. It's to come to an answer. It's to guide someone towards a certain outcome. And actually, I find myself now, especially as I work with a team myself, I often tell my teammates, actually the times that are most valuable in our interactions are the times when we disagree. Not when you just take what I just said and said, yeah, that sounds great, let's just go ahead and do it, because I actually have no idea if I'm right or not. And actually it turns out that that is true for you as well, no matter how junior you may be. And the sooner you can adopt that mindset of, I'm not just here to take notes, I'm here to contribute to the discussion and to push us towards a better decision, actually the sooner you'll get promoted, because that's what senior attorneys do. That's what the global managing director or global managing partner of your law firm does every single day. They're not necessarily just the ones typing the notes. In fact, they're not typing the notes. Their job shifts to giving advice, and that means providing a different perspective.
I think it's really critical to remember that. We had one of the authors last year talking about conflict and embracing conflict and actually seeing it as a positive in an organization and for teams. And you've just reiterated that again. I want to open up the chat for anybody who has a superpower to share their superpower with us. I think it's really, really wonderful for you to have shared yours. And I give this example. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in a course, and one of the speakers, a good colleague and friend of mine, said, "My superpower is kindness." And I thought, in a class full of law students or future lawyers, wow, way to go for her to be able to say that her superpower is kindness. And it just resonated with so many. It didn't resonate with some, but with so many, it did resonate. So if anybody has a superpower that they want to talk to, it's interesting because I think my superpower has tended to be, and I didn't realize it until many years into a career, is the ability to talk to people of all backgrounds and experiences. That's sort of a superpower. I love to connect people and to learn about people. So anybody who has a superpower, please put that in as we go to the next question for Gorick. And it's part of what you just did right now. You told us a little bit about your experiences. You told us about your superpower. But let's go to chapter 5. And in here, chapter 5 for me was really relevant for anybody starting their career, making a career transition partway through their career, and that's about telling your story. And so, Gorick, you included both a reference to internal and external narratives, and how important it is to craft both of those as you move forward in your career. It includes day one on a job, and you made that reference. What is the story that you're going to tell on day one, your internal and your external narrative? But it also includes people across career stages, during coffee chats, during meetings. Can you remind us what you mean by those internal and external narratives that we have, and what are some of the steps to gain them in the context of, with competence, commitment, and compatibility?
Mhm. Well, how many of us have ever been in a job interview where the other person asks, "Tell me about yourself"?
Yep.
And how many of us have taken that question in and started wondering, like, what do you want to know from me? Like, you want to know about where I was born? You want to know about my hobbies? Like, what do you want me to say? Well, this idea of an internal versus external narrative is my way of putting a framework, which happens to be my superpower, around this otherwise really stressful situation of tell me about myself. So for all of us, we have two sometimes aligned and sometimes different narratives. There's the external narrative, which is the story we tell others in a job interview, in an elevator pitch, in a personal introduction. And then there's the internal narrative. And that's what we tell ourselves in the morning that gets us to get out of bed and hustle for the day. And your internal narrative can be a whole bunch of things, right? It could be, I've heard, and I can relate to a lot of these, where it's, I want to provide a better living for my family. I want to pay it forward. I want to do a good job. I want to pay off my student loans. Or it's, why am I here? Well, it's because it's the only job I got. This was the only offer I received. Or I'm here to build my resume. And this isn't necessarily my forever job, but I think I'm going to be here for a little bit, learn as much as I can, and then see where I can go next. Or it's, I want to get promoted, and I want to get promoted really quickly. Or it's, hey, this is a really great brand name on my resume. I want it for this internship, and maybe not long term, but I think it's going to be good for me in terms of the network that I can build and the name that's going to last on my resume. Those are your internal narratives. And then there's the external narrative. And that's what others want to hear when they're evaluating your 3 C's of, are you competent, committed, and compatible? Now, when it comes to introducing yourself, I also have a framework for that inspired by Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but if you think about many superhero stories or any story, they always follow a certain arc where the hero or the heroine starts off just living their normal life, and then poof, there's a spark of inspiration. Whether it's Spider-Man getting bitten by a spider, or name your favorite superhero and something that happens in their life that then jolts them into an adventure. And then they're on an adventure, and that's what the Marvel movies are all about. And they're fighting villains. And it's all in purpose of a broader mission and purpose. Well, your external narrative is your hero's journey. It's, where are you coming from? What got you interested in this path in the first place? What have you done? What have you done that's above and beyond in pursuit of this broader mission? And where do you see yourself in the future? And how does this experience that you're now interviewing for, or that you just got a job to, how does this fit in with that broader hero's journey that convinces me that you're competent, committed, and compatible? That's the invisible, that's the unspoken framework for answering an interview question. So instead of saying what I did, which is, hi, my name is Gorick. I studied political science. I was born and raised in Toronto. What else do you want to know? I would say instead, and it depends on the job, but for example, when I was applying for an investment banking job and didn't have any experience in that field at all, I would say, my name is Gorick, and as I think about how I've spent my time in university, I've been trying to understand how to build a business and then how to grow a business. And I took it upon myself to run a dry cleaning business. And it was through that I realized there's so many different aspects to running and growing a successful business. You have to have the people, you have to have the operations, and you have to have the finances. And what I really got excited about was the latter, of how do all the numbers fit together in terms of how a dollar comes in and then a dollar goes out. And as I think about what I'd like to do next, is I'd love to be able to learn more about how to grow and build businesses through the lens of finance. And that's what brings me here today. Now, I totally made that up. And as I'm even just recounting the story to you, I'm realizing I didn't really quite say that, but you see the ingredients of what I just did there? You see what I just tried to do there, which is I tried to pull in something, even if it seems that on the surface unrelated, and I try to build this connection to what I'm trying to do now. And I'm trying to demonstrate that, hey, I'm invested in this. So give me a chance. And so try that in your next job interview, and let me know how it goes.
And not just the job interview, right? It's job interview and the coffee chats. It's all of those situations where you can where you're going to be asked about, tell me about yourself, the first time that you're meeting somebody new. So I appreciate that. In the interest of time, you know, we're not covering all the chapters. I love the chapters that you did on feedback, but let's go to chapter 8, taking ownership, and that was one that is particularly impactful to me because I oftentimes see people who are in those very early stages who are still in student mode, even if they're 1, 2, or 3 years even out in their careers. And one of the reasons why it resonated, I actually sent this quote to a few different people over the last couple of days. Taking ownership, you quote towards the end of the chapter, the needed mindset shift that we have to have moving from, you know, a student in the student mode to a work mode. And you quote, shifting your mindset from I'll wait for instructions to I'll try to figure it out. You're taking ownership of what's in front of you. And you explore understanding assignments, you explore squashing problems, staying one step ahead of your boss, even thinking about those things. Again, unspoken rules. I'm just here to do my job. And now you're telling me that I actually have to think about squashing problems, looking ahead, taking ownership. Tell me a little bit about what your key takeaways are from this chapter, Gorick.
Sure thing. Well, um, I don't know how many of you have received the feedback that I did in numerous jobs in the past, which is that I need to take more ownership.
Mhm.
I've heard this from countless managers towards their teams of, oh, I just wish my employees could take more ownership. I heard this from a CEO just the other day about the entire company. I wish more people could take more ownership. What does it mean to take ownership? And it actually requires reframing what the job of your manager is. And I'm going to quote from someone that I had interviewed for the book, which is to think of your job not as the person who just takes instructions, but as the person whose job is to manage your manager. Now, you're probably like, wait, I'm not getting paid enough to manage my manager. What's going on? Isn't this their job? Well, actually, what I realized is if you can adopt the mindset of my job isn't just to do the job, my job isn't just to agree, it's to manage my manager, you start actually conducting yourself in a totally different way. I'll give you a couple of examples. What I used to do in the past was my manager, let's say Gina's my manager, she would give me an assignment. What would I do? I would smile and nod, and I would say, sounds great. I'll get back to you. And then I would disappear, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. And then I'd come back and oftentimes hand in work that was not at all what Gina wanted. And this would be a downward spiral because I would do that once. Gina would get concerned. Gina would probably keep a closer eye on me next time. Gina might divert some of the more interesting assignments to a coworker. I might start feeling discouraged because I'm not feeling like Gina's investing in me. I'm not feeling like I understand what's going on. I'm not feeling comfortable speaking up and asking questions. And before I even have a chance to bump my head up against that so-called glass ceiling, I've already left the job. And that unfortunately happens to far too many people. Now imagine a different scenario where Gina says, hey, can you look into this? And how many of you have heard that at work, right? Your manager gives you a super ambiguous assignment of, can you look into this? Well, it turns out I have a framework in my book called Why, What, How, by When, where it's important to ask yourself, why is this being asked of me? What do I need to do? What is the deliverable? Is this a memo? Is this an email? Is this a conversation? How, as in, how should I do this? Is there a template that I should follow? Are there just numbers and information I should update? Or should I write something from scratch? Should I ask 10 friends? And then by when? And every assignment at work has two deadlines. There's the explicit deadline of Gina says she needs it at 12 noon on Friday of this week. And then there's the invisible deadline because maybe Friday at noon is when the client meeting is happening. And before this work can go to the client, it needs to go back to Gina. But in between Gina and the client, it needs to go to Gina's manager. And before I can bring it to Gina, I have to consult this coworker, and this coworker. So my deadline isn't actually this Friday, it's tomorrow afternoon, perhaps, for a first draft. So knowing that mental checklist now allows me to better ask questions of Gina, help me understand, should I just go ahead and update the memo that we've been tossing back and forth, or were you looking for me to write something totally new? And I know that I have a meeting with so and so tomorrow. Would it be helpful for me to run this by him just to make sure that I'm on the right track? Sounds good. Gina, I noticed that you're um, out of office this Wednesday. Should I get it to you on Tuesday before you leave? And oh, sounds good. You'll read it on the road. In that case, should I just type it up in bullet points so that you can easily scroll through it in your email, or would you like it in a PDF? Sounds great. I'll get back to you, and let me just put some time on your calendar for tomorrow morning. Just maybe it's a quick 10-minute conversation. How does that sound? And what did I just do there? I just managed Gina. I didn't do it in a confrontational way. I did it in an inviting, collaborative way of, hey, let's work through this together. And that is the characteristic. That's what it looks like and sounds like to be a high performer and a high potential, to be taking ownership.
I have to say that the team members that I have worked with who have been able to successfully manage me have been the greatest performers and the ones that I would rely on repeatedly. So, to your point, it really is a benefit to sort of be able to figure that out. A, its importance, and B, how to do it. Tiffany, I'm seeing your question. I'm going to put it to Gorick after we get to when we get to the questions and answers. I just want to acknowledge your curiosity and Sandra's curiosity as well, and think about it in the question and answer period. So hold on, we'll get to it, Tiffany. I appreciate it. Gorick, the next chapter we want to turn to, because I teach on emotional intelligence, and I talk about lawyers and people in the legal profession having the need to understand how relationships impact their work and the work of others. And as I was reading through the Unspoken Rules, you reminded us that all careers have it. My husband keeps telling me, he's in banking. He keeps saying it's not just lawyers; it's everything that you do. Relationships are important. Human beings are part of every single job. Even if you're doing something solo, you have clients, you have team members from other areas. So it's really important to think about sparking relationships. And I'm going to ask you about the 3 steps, but I want to give a couple of examples in terms of relationships and how I've experienced them. On the one is a personal one. When I was working at 2 of the other universities and law schools in Ontario, I had contacts who then became acquaintances, who then became friends and future colleagues, I didn't know it at the time, that I would stay in touch with. At that time, TMU, then Ryerson, had no law program whatsoever, but there was a talk of a possible interest, and I'd be maintaining those relationships, not because I wanted to only think about that aspect. I liked them. I was curious what they were doing and how they were applying what they were doing towards that possible goal. And when the time came for the law practice program to start at the university, it was sort of almost a natural, oh yeah, we've had these conversations with Gina. Let's think about bringing her on. And so those conversations over, and it wasn't a short period of time, it was over about 5 or 6 years, ongoing relationships, just building on a regular basis, authentically and honestly, where when the opportunity arose, it was like, hey, I'd like to be considered for this. Hey, yeah, we'd like you to be considered for this. Let's have a conversation. And the other example, because you talk about relationships and ending things on a positive note, I believe in not burning bridges when you end a role. And my very first job out of law school, where I articled and I practiced, was with a smaller firm here in Toronto. And the one of the partners was a board member at a bank. And about 6 years after I left, we were at a gathering. He and I were catching up. We kept our relationship going because I really respected the work they did. I just chose to move on to a different part of my career. And he said to me, "Wasn't your husband in banking?" I said, "Yeah, in fact, he is." And I sort of pointed to him down the room, and he said, "Well, the board is in need of a particular executive position, and do you think he'd be open to a conversation?" I said, "Sure, he's over there. Why not?" So that led to one of my husband's most favorite jobs that he's had. And again, if I had burned that relationship, burned that bridge, those conversations may not have happened. So long introduction perhaps, and I apologize. I just wanting to give that introduction, the examples, Gorick, when you talk about sparking relationships, you talk about three things: sparking the connection, and that's hard for a lot of people, playing the game, and people feel a little nervous about playing a game, but also sustaining the momentum. Can you speak to us about those three things?
Absolutely. Well, how many of you have struggled with this idea of networking or been told that you need to build deeper relationships or put yourself out there more or build your network? Well, I, I've struggled with this for as long as I can remember. Celeste, glad to hear I'm not alone. Um, what does it actually entail? And it wasn't until I started doing this research that I realized that there's a more structured way to think about building relationships. And I call it the relationship ladder, where at the bottom, at the bottom rung of that ladder are strangers. And just by definition, there are a lot of people in this world. Most people in the world are strangers to you. However, if you've just said hi to them in the hallway or exchanged an email with them, exchanged eye contact with them in class at law school, well, you will have just converted them from stranger status to acquaintance status. And you've just given yourself permission to say hello to them again, to exchange contact information, to share an article that you've read, to let them know of an opportunity. And that's when you've converted them from acquaintance status to ally status. Think about all the people you've met in law school who've traded notes with you, shared opportunities with you, invited you to parties, whatever it is. Those are allies. And now think about all the people who you may have met who are maybe just half a step ahead of you. Maybe in law school, they were 1 year ahead of you, or 2 years ahead of you, or maybe just a semester ahead of you. And they're whispering in your ear saying, hey, this is a great professor, or this is a cool opportunity, or ignore this deadline. It's actually 2 months earlier. Well, those are mentors. Those are people who know something you don't and can help you figure out what you don't know, but should know. And then one step above that are people who are further along in their career. And if you're working at a law firm, for example, these might be folks at the partner level who are in those closed door conversations and who have the ability to bang on the table for your promotion, for that big break, for that career building opportunity. Those are sponsors. And so when I started thinking about this ladder of strangers to acquaintances to allies to mentors to sponsors, I started realizing, oh wow, actually the job of networking is to just bring people up this ladder one rung at a time. Now, not everyone's going to be the mentor, and that's okay. But it all just begins with looking left, looking right, and saying hi. I've now done sessions with a number of law firms in in Canada as well as around the world. And one of the things that I like to ask some of the more senior folks is, tell me about some of the most outstanding lawyers that you know about, and how did they get started? And more than one of them have told me, actually, I would say probably most of them have told me kind of the same story, which is that their most outstanding attorneys, lawyers, they walk the halls. And it's code for just walking down the hall and saying, hi, I think we only ever met over Zoom, but I wanted to introduce myself in person. Or, hello, great presentation. I'd love to learn more about your practice area. They're the people who spark relationships, who find just those tiny excuses to turn a stranger into an acquaintance, and then further, and then onwards and upwards. So that's the whole idea of sparking relationships and then hopefully bringing them to something more.
I appreciate that. And I just want to double check. Can people hear and see Gorick okay? Or have we lost Gorick? I just want to make a quick thumbs up. Can we see Gorick? Because
Oh,
Gorick,
that's really strange. I am still here.
there we go. Okay. Sandra or anybody else can give me a thumbs up. There we go. Okay. All right. Lost. Yeah, I see some people saying lost video. So Gorick,
Okay,
there
strange.
was
I'm
a
sorry.
you were frozen initially with a thumbs up, and I loved it, or a bubble with a thumbs up. We can hear you, okay? But I just wanted to make sure that others could hear you and see you. We
Oh,
could.
okay. I'm sorry about that. I am still seeing my camera connected and all that. Let me try to reconnect,
There
but
we
I'm
go.
otherwise still here. Oh, hello.
Gotcha.
Okay,
Okay,
that's
I
never
just
happened
wanted to make
before.
sure. I love the little bubble ahead of above your head that I saw with the thumbs up. It was like you're telling yourself, "Yes, I'm doing okay. Everything is going well." The internal voice is speaking. So thank
Better
you.
to be stuck doing this.
Absolutely. I love the rung, the ladder. I think that that's really important, and to recognize for everybody who might be worried, as Gorick said, people have this feeling about networking. They don't really like doing it. Even sometimes saying that first hello, even sometimes saying that first how's it going? And so being able to overcome that and just recognize that little spark could really move people up the ladder a step at a time. So I appreciate that thinking. I want us to get to questions, and in about 5 or so minutes, we're going to open it up to people with questions. And Tiffany, will start with the question that you have. So let me just ask this last question. You talk about performance, and performance in my mind is competence. It's that first part, and that's critical. But then in the last chapter, I think it was the last chapter, chapter 15, you talk about showing your potential and getting promoted. So you go from not just performing, but also then showing your potential and moving up. You talk about 5 ways that we can find and I love this phrase, an unoccupied swim lane that matters to the team. So not just an unoccupied swim lane, but that matters to the team, and position ourselves for a promotion. You want to talk a little bit about what we should do to get ourselves not just doing the job, but then thinking about being able to shine and to show your potential.
Yes, absolutely. Well, um, if you are at all interested in getting promoted, getting to that next level, and if you have ever found yourself wondering, hey, I'm doing my job so well, why is no one giving me the recognition, or what am I missing? Chances are and people will use code like put yourself out there. What does it actually look like? Well, the idea of claiming an unoccupied swim lane is to look left, look right, and ask yourself, what matters to those who matter? What is causing stress to those in charge? What is wasting them time? What is a goal of theirs over the next month, quarter, year? What is something that they need to get done that no one has volunteered for, and that I might be able to take on and volunteer for and claim for myself? So I have examples from all different businesses. So I know one of you is in engineering. I remember interviewing someone who was in engineering who noticed that his team was basically just walking all over each other. They were releasing a product and they were releasing software, and there were multiple engineers all releasing different features as part of the software. And it was uncoordinated, as in one person was doing one thing, another person was doing another thing. Sometimes it was in conflict with each other. And what he noticed was, actually, what she noticed was that, well, duh, of course this is happening because we're not talking to each other. There's not a calendar, there's not a feature release calendar. And so what she did was she went from coworker to coworker and asked them, hey, I couldn't help but notice that this could have been a little bit more coordinated. Is this something that you've been experiencing as well? And after walking the halls virtually and noticing that everyone was struggling with the same problem and was in desperate need of a feature release calendar, she then went to her manager and said, hey, maybe you've already thought about this, but I couldn't help but notice this. Have we ever thought about this? And the manager said, oh my goodness, we haven't had time to really build one. And then she said, well, I'd love to take this on if you're open to it. Fast forward 6 months, and this ended up being the reason why she ended up getting promoted, because she went above and beyond. She showed that she was competent enough to think about the big picture, committed enough to think about what hadn't been done yet, and compatible enough to rally others around her idea versus just declare it out of nowhere. Now, when it comes to law, I know law firms are rethinking their businesses all the time, especially given generative AI and just so much happening in the world. What is the global managing partner thinking about and talking about? What are some of the emails that are coming out on a weekly basis about where the firm is going? What are the practice areas that seem desperately understaffed that might be the biggest line of business for the company going forward? If you're in public service, thinking about some of the folks who run the department, thinking about where maybe the political environment is, um, and asking yourself, what is a problem that others haven't fixed? What is information that I have that I haven't, that no one has ever shared before? What are maybe conversations that I can have with people that people are not having? What is an introduction that I can offer that maybe no one has offered before? And ultimately, how can I grow into a role that might not even exist yet? That's the idea of claiming a swim lane and then ultimately getting a promotion or maybe even creating a position out of nowhere.
Oops, I love it, and, I wanna recognize Alina for saying that she recently found one, so congratulations on finding your swim lane. I think that that's what you're referencing, in that instance, Alina. Keeping open, right? Keeping open to the possibilities and being curious, and so on that, I'm going to pivot to our questions from the audience, and, that curiosity is something that, is a great segue, Tiffany, to yours. So I'll read out the question, Gorick, and then Tiffany, if you want to add to it, please let me know. But by the kind you say you've been praised as curious, by the critical you've been told that you ask too many questions. I get that. I admit that my questions are often to make sure that the individual or group deliberating has examined all sides. I'd like to learn how to better frame questions to reflect this and so that they're more appreciated. Any suggestions? Gorick, what do you think on this one?
I love that question, Tiffany, and it's one of the biggest anxieties that professionals face at work. How do I ask questions without coming across as lazy or incompetent or a know-it-all or annoying?
Mhm.
Um, and what I notice is I've got a framework for everything. Here's one, which is to do your homework and then show your homework. So what I notice at work is that it's easy to just jump into a question without providing context behind where that question is coming from. Try this instead. I noticed this, or in my research on this, or in our conversations, we talked about this. However, or can you tell me more about this? So instead of asking, I'm going to make this up of Gina, when is our conversation tonight?
Mhm.
Which could be interpreted in a host of different ways. Gina could walk away from that question thinking, was he not paying attention to our last conversation? Did he not read his emails? Has he not checked his Google Calendar? What's going on with Gorick? What I could say instead is, hey, Gina, I know we said that we would have this fireside chat on Tuesday. Looking at my calendar, I don't see anything on the calendar yet. And in our prior correspondence, we talked about 7 o'clock, but I think we also may have talked about 7:30. Could you please clarify the specific time? And what did I just do there? I just showed, hey, look, here's all the homework that I've done and all the deep thinking that I've done independently before asking this question. And then this is the sliver of information that I could use your help on. Help me out. And so what you just did is you demonstrated that this, by definition, is not a stupid question because you've done everything in your control to answer your own question previously. So it's hard to give you a one size fits all answer, Tiffany. But when in doubt, show your homework, which I know you've done, just to provide some context into where that question might be coming from and why it adds to the conversation and people's understanding.
And Tiffany, I'm gonna just, Gorick, you can give us some feedback on this. Feedback. You have suggested, Tiffany, that some give you feedback that you are curious as a positive, and others give you feedback that you ask too many questions, almost as a negative. And so, even on the whole chapter of feedback work and how we should take feedback, there's that other element, not just on the questions and how you deal with the questions, which I love the framework. But Gorick, briefly thinking about this from the context of feedback, anything that you would add in that context?
Absolutely. Well, when it comes to feedback, there is the unspoken rule of praise publicly and correct privately.
Mhm.
So you might see that typo in a coworker's presentation. The best time to let them know is maybe ahead of time or afterwards, one on one. Otherwise, you might risk coming across as if you're being threatening, that you're trying to make the other person look bad. But then don't withhold that praise, share it and share it widely. where give shout outs, let others know, oh, credit really does go to so and so and so and so. Now, I know there are a lot of women here in our conversation here today. One of the common concerns that I hear from women is a man who probably didn't do the work or did half the work getting more credit than they deserve. So being careful as well about and being mindful of making sure that you stake your claim on the credit that you deserve. And that means giving status updates of this is what I'm working on, this is why it matters, this is what I've done, and this is what I still need to do. Making sure that people even just know what you're working on is really important, because otherwise someone else could just swoop in, claim all the credit, even though they did zero of the work.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate it. Tiffany, anything more that you want to ask or comment on?
It could be based on the level of the manager who was managing Gina. But as you gave the examples about asking Gina, to me that just like set like flashbacks of I would be deemed as asking too many questions or incompetent, or I should have just figured that out on my own rather than ask Gina. So would you say that that was purely based on somebody who was more entry level or at an assistant level, or for everyone?
So it's a good question, and it's hard to give that one size fits all because there's nuances to every situation. Um, there could be situations where that could come across as asking too many questions, especially if some of those questions may be ones that you could have answered ahead of time. And what I hear about a lot is this unspoken rule of the meeting before the meeting. So it could be the case that if Gina is a senior client, a senior leader in the firm, that these are questions that are maybe too in the weeds or too junior to be escalating to someone of Gina's level. And instead, it should be higher level strategic questions or questions that maybe a deputy of Gina would be in a better position to answer. So this somewhat comes back to the doing and showing your homework, because the art of asking these questions comes down to understanding what are the questions that you can frame in a way that sounds as if Gina is the only and best person to ask these questions to, versus let's take this question, let me take this question offline. Let me pass it by a coworker instead. So yes, Tiffany. And when in doubt, having that meeting before the meeting can be really helpful. And what that looks like could be that you may not have worked with Gina before, but Claire here in the room has. And maybe one of the meetings that you have before the meeting involves reaching out to Claire and saying, I noticed that you previously worked with Gina, or I noticed your name on this matter. Might you have a few minutes to provide me with some context? I'm about to have a meeting with Gina coming up this Thursday. That might arm you with a few more answers than you would have otherwise had to ask Gina for one-on-one. Does that help?
Great comments. Gorick, I've got a question that's been asked, and it took me to an example that you gave in your book, and I think it was in the chapter on relationships. So I'm going to refer the person to that chapter, but let me ask the question, and I want to acknowledge the vulnerability here. What's the best way to maintain networks with people from firms after you get laid off from an industry such as perhaps banking or consulting, or any industry for that matter? And then the question that comes after is, how do you get past the feeling of shame or worry that people have said things about you that can hurt your career, that you can't defend yourself or reputation if people you respect hear things about you? So getting laid off, and then maintaining those relationships in the network and trying to get past that feeling. And I want to acknowledge anybody who's been laid off or anybody who has lost a job for various reasons. That doesn't define who you are, and let's see how we can move past that in a way that is not riddled with shame or worry. But Gorick, over to you, because I remember the one example from somebody's daughter in your book, one of the speakers' daughter in your book. But let me just hear from you on that.
Yeah, let's actually start with that story where there was a CEO that I had met, and he had told me the story of his daughter who had gotten laid off. and who ended up, fast forward, getting an email from the CEO saying, "What a class act. I'd love to help you find your next role." What happened there? Well, in this particular instance, it's in the last chapter of the book. This individual was laid off, but they were very gracious about it. And they ended up sending a team-wide email thanking all the people who had contributed to her projects, who had mentored her, who had coached her, who had inspired her, and then added a note about how she was cheering the team on towards this next milestone. And the context behind that was there was a restructuring of the organization, and she wasn't just laid off because of low performance. You could be in that case as well. But she was very gracious about it, and she thanked a lot of people. Now, I have the exact email that I had that person had written in the chapter, and I'm struggling to remember all the exact details. So check out that chapter if you're interested. But what are the lessons? Let me give you a couple. Number one is when you've been laid off, it's easy to get into the mindset of clearly it's because everybody hates me, versus this was the decision of maybe one person or one committee, and it was likely due to factors that are beyond just me. Let me come back to that in a second. And then number two is the fact that you were laid off doesn't invalidate all the great that you had done and all the amazing relationships you had built. And number three is just because you were laid off doesn't mean anybody is going to remember that you've been laid off, especially years from now. So keeping in mind those three things, what can we do about it? Well, the first is to ask yourself, what was the broader context behind this layoff? And people get laid off, unfortunately, all the time. And every time I open the news, a news article browser, there's another company that's doing layoffs these days. It could be the macro environment. It could be that the company isn't making as much money or isn't as optimistic about a certain business unit as it used to be. Maybe they overhired and now they're compensating for it. Maybe someone in charge is indecisive about where people should be allocated. It could be that there was a favorite pick for a certain role and it wasn't you, or it could be that it was a performance challenge. Now, I probably ran out of fingers here in terms of even counting all the other reasons as to why you could have been laid off aside from performance being one of the possible many others. So even just thinking about, wait, what are the things that were in my control and what are the things that were outside of my control can be helpful because, again, not everybody hates you. The second is, now let's say it is a performance evaluation. Let's do the doom and gloom story of maybe you could have done a little bit better, or you could have navigated a certain set of situations a little bit more elegantly. Okay, fine. That is with one person, and that is with one manager. You've probably, if you've been sparking relationships, met dozens of people around your team, around your organization, who may not even have the context behind you being laid off, nor would they even know that you were laid off. Maybe they just know that you're going off and pursuing another opportunity. So what I would do is I would make a list of every person that I've met, that I've worked with, and I would send them a personal email. And then I would CC my personal inbox if that's allowed. And I would send them a personal note. And I would use language like, thanks for this. I will always remember this. I'm grateful for this. I'm looking forward to this. And be specific with each person. Connect with them on LinkedIn and stay in touch with them. Share information with them. Congratulate them on milestones if they've had any. And actually, something that I've started doing myself is I started writing a year-end update to former colleagues of mine. And I send it out sometime between Christmas and New Year's. And it's now, I think, 4 years in the running. And the first time I wrote it, I was super nervous about clicking send, because I was thinking, boy, I have colleagues of mine from years ago. They probably don't care what I'm doing. But I wrote this personal note about how I had built this list of people who had inspired me and made me a better person and made me think and made me smile. And sometime over the past year, I had thought of you and I decided to add you to this list just to let you know how I'm doing. And it's been the best thing that's ever happened to me. because it's allowed me to stay in touch with people from jobs that I've been laid off from myself.
I really love that. I've got to tell you, I think that that really is incredible. And one situation happening is not the be all and end all, and find ways to be able to embrace those who are your champions, your allies, your mentors as you move forward. So I appreciate the question. Let me just, I see Alina's comment about a short LinkedIn message, help me to land a job. I really like that. I agree with that. Let me ask if there's any other questions. I've got one other one, but I want to see if others in the group have questions first before we go. Ivana, join us. Hello, how are you? There you
Hello.
are.
There we go. Hi, how are you?
Good.
Um, Gorick, thank you. I really liked your book, especially because I think it has a very broad application. A lot of the concepts that you described have a very broad application. I certainly see it with different audiences. I don't know, when you were writing the book, whether you had a specific audience in mind. I'm not a first gen, but I am a foreign trained professional, and I came here in my 20s to Canada, and I had to learn some of these unspoken rules, as I was starting out. And I feel pretty, after 20 something years in Canada, I feel almost like Canadian business culture is more familiar to me now than my Croatian business culture where I'm from. So, and Gina and I both worked with foreign trained professionals, and I think a lot of this is very applicable to teaching that audience about the unspoken rules, and particular in a sense of a different business culture. And then I also think, perhaps generationally, when you look at different generations, I wonder whether you noticed, I know you wrote the book recently, but whether you noticed that these things change over time, and whether this is something that you need to pay attention to. Definitely, I think with my sense is that, with the evolution of technology and, LinkedIn, when I started out, there was no LinkedIn. There was no etiquette about networking on LinkedIn or, similar media. And so I just wonder, what your thoughts are about the evolution of this over time. And, certain things, obviously, I think are very, they're not affected by time as much. But, some things I think are. I certainly see my son, who's in university now, the way he approaches things. And even though I was a career advisor, in some things, these kids do things differently today, and that's how it's done now, or in where he is at right now. So those are my two. I guess I just wanted to say I appreciate that the application is very broad, but I was also interested, whether you think this changes over time, or whether you teach this differently to different audiences.
Great question.
I love the questions, and thank you first of all for reading my book. The best thing you could do to support this effort is threefold, if you're okay with it. One is to leave a review on Amazon and or Goodreads, if that's a platform that you use. It's a great way for folks to hear real people talking about my work. The second is sign up for my email list. I've just dropped both links into the chat window here, where we'll have a chance to stay in touch. And then 3 is tell a friend or tell a colleague, especially if they work in a larger organization, about the use of this book in their institution. But thank you.
Buying the book for my son, actually.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate
He's
that.
getting the book. You'll enjoy it.
Thank you. So to address your 2 points, one is foreign trained professionals, which I want to address quickly, and then the evolving nature of the workforce. So first is, I could always do a better job of finding the universal applicability or exceptions to some of these unspoken rules. What I have noticed is when I interview folks, I've interviewed folks in Ukraine, in Ghana, in South Africa, in Vietnam, in Canada, of course. And what I notice is there are different flavors of how some of these unspoken rules are expressed. For example, and a lot of it comes down to cultural differences that are summarized in one of my favorite books called The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. And in a nutshell, if you search for The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer, you'll see HBR articles and other resources that talk about how different cultures will have different standards around directness. Some cultures are much more indirect, some are very direct. And if you have someone who works in an indirect culture, giving feedback to someone who's more comfortable in a direct culture, maybe that indirect person sounds really wishy-washy and very uncertain and very disorganized. And then meanwhile, the opposite can occur where the person who grew up working in a direct culture seems rude, seems condescending. So there's a lot around this that is a matter of cultural differences. Onwards to your other question of the changing nature of the workforce. Well, let me cite two things. One is formality. And that also exists on a spectrum, right? Where the number of institutions and environments where you put dear so-and-so, comma, next paragraph are vanishing. There are more that treat professionalism along the spectrum of, do you use exclamation marks or do you use emojis? There's also formality as it relates to, oh, you're sending me a text message instead of on Slack, versus before it would have been, you would have given me a phone call versus send me an email. So there are a lot of differences that are evolving in that front. Now, given that we're in the era of remote work, I think we're still waging a real battle between generations around how one and whether we should even be thinking about these 3 C's, or if it's really just about 1 C, which is competence. So I've spoken to university audiences, those who are still in school, and sometimes I get the feedback of, wait a second, why does anyone care? Why should anyone care that I'm committed or that I can get along with anybody if I can do my job? If I'm smart and I can do the job well, why should anyone even care? And how dare they evaluate my commitment and my compatibility? I brought up remote work here because when we think about generational differences, those of the working in person generation are probably more inclined to think, well, if you can't even show up for this in-person meeting, how can I trust that you're invested in this process? And then meanwhile, someone else who may have grown up going to Zoom University would think, well, why am I even in the office? How is that a demonstration of commitment if I'm doing my job and I'm handing things in on time and I'm showing up to meetings early all the time? So we're fighting that intergenerational arm wrestle right now continually. That's something that's going to it's sort of this, we'll have to wait and see. However, I personally have a hard time imagining how promotion decisions won't continue to be based on competence, commitment, and compatibility. It might just be a matter of time before those who question the value of commitment and compatibility find themselves in positions of power and wondering who they should be promoting.
No, I agree. And the stat, and I think you may have had it in your book, and I know I've seen it in a few different places. This is currently the time when we have 5 different generations working in the workplace at the same time. And that means they think differently about what it means to show up. They think differently about what it means to communicate, how to communicate. So it's really important to just acknowledge that. And I think that's a great question, Ivana. And I want to be mindful of the time. Rebecca, over to you before we close, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Gorick, I'm wondering if you can say a few words about how you recommend finding the balance between practicing in these unspoken rules, and then holding true to your own values and authenticity. And you spoke a bit about it with the reject and bend and embrace, but just anything else you can offer to sort of, as people try to navigate the rules.
Great question.
Oh, I love that question. I love that question. Thank you for bringing it up, Rebecca. I wish I had had more time and space and word count in the book to talk about this. Although I have started talking about it more and more in a lot of my keynotes at schools in particular, where it actually brings us all the way full circle back to where we started in this conversation, the 3 C's. I frame those 3 C's as the criteria that people will be evaluating you against. However, it's important to remind your mentees, to remind ourselves, that we should be evaluating others' 3 C's just as much. When it comes to the C of competence, look around the room, look higher up in the organization. Do you look up to and can learn from your coworkers and the leaders in this organization? Yes, no. Think about commitment. Think about the higher ups and whether they're invested in your growth and development. And then finally, with compatibility, can you show up feeling comfortable in your own skin, or do you feel like you have to be someone that you're not? And it's important to think about whether you'll thrive in this environment if you have to sacrifice one or more of those 3 C's. So the world is a big place, and while it may be the case that you may get laid off from a job, as we talked about just now, but don't feel like you have to stay in a place that isn't giving you all 3 of those 3 C's. In fact, I would argue that if you're not feeling like this is an opportunity, this is a team, this is a manager that can give you all 3 of those C's, it may be a sign that you could go further, faster somewhere else. That's a much longer conversation, but that is something important to think about.
Rebecca,
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's really, really important. And just before Gorick and I launched, we were talking about when I was going through the articling process. I was just mentioning I had bought my one dark olive green suit because that was the color that I wanted to show up in. I didn't want a dark blue or a gray. And being in a cocktail area at one particular organization where literally it was a sea of blue and gray. And I found myself thinking, I can't, there'd be of course there's competence there, but the compatibility part and whether or not there would be commitment there on them committed to me, as Gorick said, in terms of me being able to grow there as authentically as I could, and me being able to commit to them. If I wasn't able to show up authentically was really important. And the place that really appreciated the olive green suit for some reason was the place that I felt I could grow and learn. So I think your question, that's just a small example, but I think it's a really important conversation. So Gorick, thank you for both raising it in the book and responding to it. We are at 8:30 and I want to be very mindful of everybody's time. Gorick, I am going to share this document. I know we didn't get a chance, so you spoke to it, but definitely if you want just to remind us what this is, and then I'll do the next slide.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'd love, love, love to stay in touch. And if at least a fraction of what I shared today resonates with you, I encourage you to connect with me on social media, find me on LinkedIn. And moreover, come onto my website, gorick.com/career strategies, and sign up for my email newsletter every week, every Monday. I deconstruct the untold paths to success of someone you probably know, maybe not directly, someone like Taylor Swift or Denzel Washington or Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany. But I spend a great deal of time each week trying to understand how they got to where they are today. And if that's of interest to you, I invite you to join me on that newsletter.
I love it. I love it. Again, his LinkedIn is noted on this site as well. His website is there. If anybody wants to connect with me, I've got my email and my website as well. Before I close off, just a reminder that next month we are going to continue the conversation about how we, in essence, how we tell our story with bragging rights with Lisa Bragg on February the 27th. But before I close, I want to read something from Gorick's book as a reminder. Your afterword, I think, was a really great reminder to all. Hiking up a career is a negotiation between humans and humans. You need someone to pull you up. You need a good boss and a boss's boss. I think he may have said, and a boss's boss's boss. And so you ask that we pay it forward, answer that cold email, mentor that stranger, help that outsider, support that coworker, share that knowledge. And when you become part of the decision-making and leadership teams as the boss, hire that unproven candidate, develop that employee, offer that pep talk, share that opportunity, reward the hard work, fight that injustice. So on that note, I want to sincerely thank you for fighting the injustice, for writing this book, and for joining us this evening to talk about the Unspoken Rules. Thank you so much, Gorick.
Thank you so much, Gina. And thank you all for taking the time and for your thought-provoking questions. I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
I appreciate it. Thank you to everyone, and stay safe, be well, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, everyone. Good night.